How to Do Referendums Properly by the former Brexit Secretary David Davis MP.
But in a democracy, voters have to know what they're voting for, what the choice is.
In the EU referendum, Leave voters couldn't know what they would get. The Leave choice was not defined.
For that to work, the proposition has to come first, and the vote afterwards.
That didn't happen in the EU referendum. The vote came first, and the proposition for Leave came afterwards.
There is a proper role for referenda in constitutional change, but only if it's done properly.
By your own rules, the EU referendum wasn't done properly. So, why didn't you speak up?
Referendums should be held when the electorate are in a position, the best possible position, to make a judgment.
But in the EU referendum, the electorate wasn't in any position, let alone the best possible position, to judge if we should leave the EU. In the referendum, nobody knew the terms of leaving.
They should be held when people can view all the arguments for and against. And they should be held when those arguments have been rigorously tested.
In the EU referendum, the Leave arguments had not been tested, let alone rigorously tested. Promises made by the Leave side hadn't been debated or agreed in Parliament before the referendum.
In short, referendums should be held when people know exactly what they're getting. This means that legislation should be debated by members of Parliament on the floor of the House of Commons and then put to the electorate for the voters to judge afterwards.
No one who voted for Leave knew what they were getting, let alone exactly knew. Legislation was decided after the referendum. Voters could not judge afterwards.
It does not mean that we ask people to vote on a blank sheet of paper and tell them to trust us to fill in the details afterwards.
But that's exactly what happened in the EU referendum. The Leave choice represented a blank sheet of paper, which the government filled in afterwards.
For a referendum to be fair and compatible with our parliamentary process, we need the electors to be as well informed as possible, to know exactly what they're voting for, and for a referendum to be treated as an addition to the parliamentary process, not as a substitute for it.
But the EU referendum was treated as a substitute for parliamentary decision-making. After the EU referendum, Mr Davis told MPs that the referendum had made the decision to leave the EU, so it was not up to Parliament.
Major constitutional changes justify the use of referenda because the constitutional rights of our citizens are owned by the people themselves and not by politicians. However, it's important that referenda are not misused simply as a snapshot of volatile changes of opinion, perhaps as a result of pressure of government propaganda.
But the EU referendum only represented a snapshot of volatile changes of opinion, and government ministers did push propaganda, most of which has transpired to be untrue.
That's why 𝗕𝗥𝗙𝗪 and John Smith used to talk about the settled will of the population. The concept of settled will is that of an idea that's taken root in the minds of the people, has resonance in their daily lives, and is a stable part of the way they think about the way the country should be run. It's because referenda are supposed to reflect the settled will of the people that we need to have thresholds below which they do not carry the day.
The very close referendum result of 52% to 48% did not reflect that Brexit was the settled will of the people. If a threshold had been set for the EU referendum, then Leave wouldn't have carried the day. On 11th of February 2022, I wrote to David Davis to ask him, in view of the criteria you set in 2002 on how a referendum should be done properly, how could you have considered the 2016 EU referendum to be fair and democratic? I have not received a response.